Mobile workforces, cloud applications, and digitalization are changing every aspect of the modern enterprise. And with radical transformation come new business risks. Welcome to Hybrid Identity Protection, the premier podcast for cybersecurity pros charged with defending hybrid identity environments. Presented by Semperis, the pioneer of identity-driven cyber resilience for the hybrid enterprise. And now, here's your host, 15-time Microsoft MVP and Active Directory security expert, Sean Dubey.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the HIP Podcast. My name is Sean Dubey. I am Principal Technologist North America for Semperis. It's interesting. I'm not entirely sure who listens to this podcast, but my guess is that it leans more towards practitioners and managers more than Chief Information Security Officers, CISOs, or as I learned in Asia Pacific, they call them CISOs, which might actually be a little better pronunciation. But as the title describes, CISOs are the top of the information security food chain. In this time of constant cybersecurity, cyber attacks, and increased reporting requirements, it's by no means an easy job, and it seems to have a short tenure as well. My guest today is 5-time CISO, Allan Alford. Welcome today, Allan.
Thanks for having me.
So for sort of as a level set, let's maybe start with the basic or maybe elementary for many folks, but a good level set for the discussion. I think coming from IT infrastructure, my background is IT infrastructure, not security. If you asked anyone in IT what a CISO's role is, they'd say head of information security, but they don't know anything really much more than that. What really is a CISO's general roles and responsibilities?
It's going to vary company to company, and it's going to vary based on the size of the company as well. But fundamentally, a CISO is, in my mind, there to embrace the smart risks, mitigate the bad risks, and manage all risks. And that's involving anything with technology or data, right? Not all the risks, obviously. Financial risks, not their jurisdiction. Anything involving technology, anything involving data, that's the risk posture that a CISO should have. So in my mind, that's kind of the summation of it. It's bigger than just information security. It's an executive level. This is somebody who should be co-leading the business along with the rest of the C-suite. This is somebody who should be able to understand what go-to-market is, what sales goals are, what the CEO's objectives for the company are for this year. We're going to expand into Europe, or we're going to decrease sales cycles, or whatever the focus and the targets are that the CEO has set. The CISO should be somebody who can work with the other C-suite leaders and help to achieve those goals.
How does a CISO's roles and responsibilities and cares differ from CIOs?
So CIOs are measured by two things effectively. One is uptime, and the other is how little they spend. It's really that simple. I mean, it's that black and white for most CIOs. They do cost savings measures. They do big migrations. They do cutting this technology and replacing with that technology, and all sorts of things to try to maintain the same amount of uptime and service, the same amount of business alignment, while spending as little as possible, or ideally even less than they spent the year before. Now, that being said, C-suite again, they should be there for all the things. They should know what the go-to-market strategy is. They should know what the CFO's projections and goals are. They should know what the CEO's goals are. They should know what the operational aspects of the business are. They should figure out how they can assist sales. They should figure out how they can assist marketing. It's all the same things the CISO has to do. It's just that when you differentiate between the two, it's more about uptime and cost savings for the CIO versus for the CISO, it's more about risk.
And I think that's a really key point that you brought out is risk. I think that, again, going back to infrastructure people, they don't think about risk per se, they think about uptime. There's a great old anecdote from Brian Valentine, who was one of the leaders at Microsoft and bringing out Windows Server. And he said that one day he brought his young daughter into the office, and she asked him, "Daddy, what do you do for a living?" And how am I going to explain this to my 8-year-old daughter? And they were walking past one of the data centers or one of the demo data centers or something like that. And he said, "Honey, what I do is I try to keep the lights green." So I think that's a fairly good summary of what an infrastructure, it is information security as well.
Yep.
But the difference, and as you said, is about risk and all of the subtleties around risk as the difference.
Yep. There's a lot of CISOs that are going to tell you, and I don't necessarily abide by this argument myself, but it's a common and popular position that I think is worth vocalizing. The idea that the CISO reports into the CIO, which is still the case in probably, 70, 80% of shops, the CISO still reports to the CIO. There are many who would argue there's a conflict of interest there, because the CISO's priority is to spend to solve the problem, and the CIO's priority is to not spend to solve the problem. And inherently, the CISO is going to get shuttled to the side, and the budget is going to go elsewhere. And there's, that's the argument anyway. I don't know how much I believe that. I think good CIOs and good CISOs coordinate and work together better than a lot of other pairings that the CISO could have in terms of, COO, CTO, CFO. I've reported to almost everybody, CEO. One of the best relationships I ever had was reporting directly to a CIO. And I found more traction in that role than I had reporting to a CEO in another role. So it varies, but there is an inherent conflict of goals oftentimes between the CISO and the CIO. But if the CIO is worth a salt, they understand that security and risk and uptime are all tied together. They understand that the bad guys getting in is just as significant a downtime event as the data center crashing or whatever it might be. Keeping those lights green, oftentimes risk is what keeps the lights not green. So I think it's solvable. I don't think there's an inherent conflict of interest, but I do think that the goals are oftentimes different, and those conversations need to be had and frankly put on the table.
Well, you're talking about the differences between CISOs and CIOs, and one of the aspects of this that is an emerging trend is, where is identity reporting into?
Right.
Historically, where has it reported into, and how is that changing?
Yeah, so identity was historically the CIO's jurisdiction. It was considered to be at the center of all things infrastructure. What has happened as zero trust has taken flight, as a lot of other technology approaches have taken flight in the information security realm, we're starting to see that just like you can say identity is at the core of all things infrastructure, you can also say identity is at the core of all things security. And so I think my last sort of informal poll showed about 20% of CISOs that I know now own identity, as opposed to their CIO counterpart, that identity is part of the CISO's jurisdiction. I think that trend is increasing. I think when you look at zero trust and look at things like, I'm trying to think of some good examples here. One shop I know, some good friends, if you try to access the internet, the portal, if you try to open up SharePoint, OneDrive, Outlook, whatever, you're going to be prompted to log in, you're going to get your push, you're going to do your authentication, you're going to do the thing. If you attempt to escalate something more sensitive, you're going to be re-prompted. If you attempt to escalate to something really sensitive, you may get re-prompted with even more push on terms of what you have to provide to verify and prove your identity. It's proof that identity is at the core of all things security. And so, hybrid identity protection, I think identity is the core of zero trust, is growing. And I think that's the pivot where it makes a lot of sense to have it owned by InfoSec rather than IT.
Do you feel that the message of identity being critical to security is coming across? I know it didn't used to be.
I think it is more so now, for sure. And again, I think zero trust is the reason for that. It's a little harder to tell a story of identity mattering to security if it's not part of an overarching umbrella and paradigm, and zero trust provides that rather conveniently.
A framework that people buy into and learn to accept.
Right. The inherent idea that we don't care who you are or where you are, we're not going to trust you. We're going to treat you all the same. And now, if you do want to work from Starbucks, there's no difference, right? It's all the same. And selling zero trust upstairs, I've found to be a relatively easy proposition. And then explaining to the business that identity is at the core of it is the next logical step. And taking over identity as the CISO is a logical step from there, right? Right.
So in IT organizations, the various managers and individual contributors that need to work with a CISO, what do you need to have in your pocket? What toolkit do you need to have when you're going to go talk to a CISO? What is he going to care about when you come and ask a question about security or budget or anything else like that? What is it that we should have in mind that the CISO will resonate with the CISO? What's their mindset?
Yeah, so when it comes to identity in the CISO, let's imagine the CISO does not own identity. We're in the 80% of the shops where it's owned by the CIO. The CISO is acutely aware, absolutely aware of the sprawl, the accretion, the organic weirdness, the layers upon layers of who knows what's going on, and that admin's no longer with us, all that stuff that takes place within your identity and access management solution. That's Active Directory being the most common, Okta, being a strong number 2 coming up, well, semi-strong number 2 anyway. I think AD still rules for sure. Everyone recognizes that Active Directory is broken. Not inherently and structurally, it's there to do what it does. Its implementation in almost every shop I've ever worked is broken. In fact, I'm going to say every shop I've ever worked that was an AD shop. Something was inherently broken. There's just too much to control. The tool allows for too much. It has to by the definition and design, and people take advantage. And admins come and admins go. And I mean, I was talking to one client recently. This is a little bitty startup. And we were going through Entra ID, and I was like, we have more groups than we have employees. Already, it's gotten to that degree of sprawl. And that's at a little bitty shop. Now you go to your enterprise with 50,000 employees or 100,000 employees. There is no way any one human can possibly dig through that morass and that mess and figure out what access is granted. And you talk about segregation of duties, and you talk about least privilege, and you have all these great philosophies and principles as a CISO, and then somebody presents you with an Active Directory that looks like that. Good luck.
Yeah, it's funny that you should bring up Entra ID in this situation, because you're right, it's still the same paradigm. In terms of user and group management and control and governance, it's equally as easy to get messy on that.
Yeah, they've shifted where it belongs, where it resides rather, but fundamentally and philosophically it has to be the same. I mean, you can go all the way back to NetWare's NDS. You can look at X500, not LDAP, but X500. Look at all the standards that have ever existed for identity frameworks, and they're all pretty much the same. It's groups, it's affiliations, it's permissions, it's ACLs, it's individuals, it's entities, it's computers, and it's all organized in a big heaping mess of what's supposed to access who and who's supposed to access what, and it's impossible to keep up with over time. The rigor and the hygiene required to properly maintain Active Directory, it's too much to ask of any organization. It just is.
Right, and that's, as you say, and it shows up in practice. As I love to say, 20 years of hurried choices, or 24 years of hurried
unknown
choices.
and non-understood choices.
Right.
The new admin comes in with all the vigor and all the energy in the world wanting to clean up the mess, and starts to dig and goes, ooh, I don't know if I should touch that because I don't know what will break.
Precisely.
And so by default, I don't want to break things, rules the roost. And as a result, bad security slips in. Well, security that breaks things is security that gets CISOs fired.
Right. Well, the through topic in all of this, undercurrent in all of this, is risk. Underlying everything. So for our listeners, you have a very, very popular community of people that curious as to what you have to say and have lots of commentary, and they're very involved. You did a short blog post on LinkedIn. It was literally only 69 words, and it generated 219 comments about the challenges of being a CISO today. Can you summarize sort of what that was about?
Yeah, I was just noting, in the face of Tim Brown and Joe Sullivan and SEC and all these other things going on, it seems like there's a lot of folks in the CISO seat who are a lot more worried and nervous than they used to be. I don't know if that's valid. If you're doing the right thing and always have done the right thing and operate by the rules and operate with integrity and transparency and these kinds of things, I don't think there's too much chance of those kinds of events occurring. However, you may well have to find yourself leaving an organization because if you stay, you're implicitly bought into some of these negative things that are going on. That burden is there. To be a CISO of true integrity, you have to be willing to walk. And that's a thing. That is not an easy decision to make. That's the welfare of your family. That's all the things going on. I have done it personally. I have been in a situation where I recognized I will never succeed here. I will be the scapegoat here. I am bringing these things to attention and I'm being told, shut up about it. I'm out. I'm going to walk. I'm not going to be the fool that sticks around and puts up with bad things. And I've done it before in my past. And now, flash forward to Tim Brown, Joe Sullivan, et cetera, I kind of just noticed more of this activity going on in the CISO community, and I basically just questioned everybody. I was like, what's going on here? I'm seeing a ton of CISOs switch over to vCISO. I'm seeing a ton of vCISO switch over to CISO. I'm seeing people leaving the role altogether and going to CTO, CIO, COO, CDO, whatever they can come up with to get out of it. I'm seeing people just quit and retire early. I'm seeing a lot of transition and change right now.
So help us with background. So explain the Joe Sullivan reference, and this is relating to being legally liable, right?
Yeah. So in a nutshell, Joe Sullivan was CISO at Uber when a bunch of things went down and were said and were filed, and then the government came back and said, these are lies. This was deliberate obfuscation of the truth in official filings, and therefore you're liable. And charges were pressed against him individually, not just against the company. He was up against charges. Tim Brown, similar story, SEC disclosures, blah, blah, blah. He was over at SolarWinds. This was related to all the SolarWinds breach, and this is kind of the aftermath of that. And the same thing has happened again, held individually liable. The trend seems to be that the government has now deemed that holding the CISO individually liable is going to help fix things. I disagree with that philosophy. I think it's already bad enough and hard enough being a CISO. I think the pressure to do the wrong thing is high. I think we fight, we have integrity, the vast majority of us. I'm not the only one who's walked from a bad position like that. But holding the CISOs individually liable, I don't know that that's going to affect the positive change they want to do. What it's doing is causing a lot of folks to just leave the role.
Right, and so actually one of the comments listed as one of the reasons it's difficult being a CISO today is the amount of risk personally assumed versus where the individual is in the organization.
Yeah.
Which is sort of sometimes equated to even just director level, despite the fact they've got a C in the front of their title.
Yeah, it gets very interesting because it depends on whose definition of officer of the company you're using, right? There's the SEC's definition, there's other definitions, there's the reality of it on the street, et cetera. Obviously, if the government defines the CISO as an officer, well, there you go, you're an officer and you're in trouble. You've been named. But a lot of people say, well, I'm not a real officer of the company, I'm only the CISO. The reality is where it matters and where you can be called that by who is calling you that, you're under the gun sights. The one thing I've always recommended to every CISO long before these two cases hit the streets is if you are going to be the CISO for any organization, they already have a D&O policy, a directors and officers insurance policy. As the CISO, you should be on that policy, period, end of discussion. And what a D&O policy is, for those who don't know, it says that the corporation will assume the costs of any direct action against you in terms of lawsuits and these kinds of things. So the company picks up the tab for your defense. Get on the D&O policy as a CISO. If you cannot get on the D&O policy as a CISO in today's climate, don't take the job. Go find another one.
Right. Yeah. So this is a question of personal risk and the other aspect of this is reputational risk, especially if you're a CISO that, as you say, you decide to walk.
Yep.
Your reputation is critical to be able to walk into the next place.
It is. That the CISO does, in fact, own way more risk than they like to think they do. One of the most common CISO refrains is, I'm an advisor to the company. I don't actually own the risk. I just advise. And my challenge to that is name any other C-suite role who can get away with saying, I'm just an advisor. Nobody can. Why is the CISO any different? We complain about not having a seat at the table. We complain about not being real officers of the company. We complain about I'm the only C-suite reporting to another C-suite. What's the C in my title really mean? We have all these complaints and laments, and at the same time we're saying we don't own the risk, we only advise. There might be a reason these two things are there. They might be connected.
Got it. On risk, earlier we talked about the difference between, and as much education outside the CISO role as anything else is the difference between risk management and risk mitigation. Can you help explain that?
Yeah, risk mitigation is reducing the risk as best as possible, right? Generally, there's a risk elimination is truly just eradicating the risk. The risk is my doors are wide open. Okay, fine, get deadbolts. Now you've eliminated the risk. My door's closed and locked now. Mitigation is partial elimination of risk. So maybe I get a guard dog to stand inside the door. The door's still wide open, but now there's a dog that, everyone's afraid to enter the door because there's a growling, barking dog. That's a mitigation. Management is the superset of all the dispositions of risk that you could possibly have. You might eliminate, you might transfer, you might accept, you might mitigate, you might transfer. There's all these different things you can do with risk. Management, to me, is the overarching umbrella of how you deal with all of it. And it's very important to remember risk management is our task and not any of the subsets. People say, I'm here to reduce risk. No, you're not. You're here to manage risk, because some risk is smart risk. Some risk is risk you want to embrace. The business is by definition a risk-taking organization because no one's in business who is not embracing risk. The whole point of being in business is risk. I've got X number of dollars, I've got X number of hours of people time, and I'm going to put this product out on the market and try to beat the competitors, try to meet the market's needs, and try to do it all with this investment. If I fail and I wasted those hours and those dollars, I lose. If I'm successful, I profit. That is risk. That is also the definition of business.
So it's a really advanced techniques in understanding risk, accepting risk, denying risk, mitigating risk. Mm-hmm. It's all about risk.
It is. And the CISO, back to that whole, you are a C-suite and you should be a co-leader of the business. You better darn well understand the risk the company is willfully taking. You better understand the ones that you're going to get behind. There will be times that you bring an information security risk or a data risk or some sort of under your jurisdiction risk to the table. And you're sitting around the table with the fellow C-suite and you're saying, hey, this is some scary stuff. Right now, we're vulnerable to ransomware over here. And there's a low risk that it could occur, but if we get popped, it's a major impact. Just random example of a CISO risk they might bring to the table. And then everybody else has their turn. And it turns out you've got a much greater risk in the sales side of the house right now than you do on this cybersecurity thing. And the CISO has to be one of the people to step up and say, that's cool, we can carry that risk for another quarter. This risk the CRO just brought up is actually bigger. The chief revenue officer has a bigger concern to the business. A bigger risk needs to be addressed. Resources need to be thrown at that, not at my problem. Mm. And I, as a co-leader of the business, am embracing that risk that I brought to the table. That's when you know you're doing it right.
We've talked a lot about the challenges of being a CISO today. Why would someone want to do this?
Good Lord. It's a good question. I think those of us who get into this profession do so out of a noble purpose. We're here to protect. That's a good thing. That's a powerful thing. That's a useful thing. Society needs more of that. Now, why do you go from being the original, firewall engineer to the CISO? Why do you climb that ladder and make those changes? I think as you progress in your career, you realize you can affect more change the higher up you are, right? Like as a director, I can make more broad and sweeping changes to the company than I can as a firewall admin, right? Simple physics. As the CISO, in theory, I can make the most effort and the most impact and have the most effect. So I think a lot of people assume I'm going to be a CISO because that's where this path leads, right? This is where the most ability to have effect resides, or power, if you want to call it that. It's not for everybody. I tell people all the time, why do you want to be a CISO? When I get asked, how do I become a CISO? It's a common question when you are a CISO, especially when you've done it as often as I have and you're as public on LinkedIn as I am. I get questions all the time about, hey, that's where I'm headed. How do I get there? My first question is, why do you want to be there? What exactly are you looking for? Have you just taken the idea that CISO is the pinnacle of cybersecurity and therefore that's what I must achieve? Or have you really thought through what your strengths and weaknesses are, where you are the strongest and most able, to contribute? I know people that I consider to be significantly smarter than me who are security architects who have gone through, junior to senior to, on and on and on to fellow. A fellow security architect at a technology company has as much clout and as much pull as the CISO does with the entire technology base in that company. Mm. That architect speaks and people hop and jump and do the things that need to be done. That architect has all kinds of impact, all kinds of authority, and yet gets to maintain that hands-on geekery that so many of us got into the industry for. So I often tell people, you may not want to be a CISO, you may want to be a fellow architect one day. A cybersecurity architect at the fellow level is an amazing place to be. So to answer the question, which was why do people want to become CISOs, I think everyone has different reasons, but I think a lot of people just assume because it's at the top, I want it. And I caution folks not to have that mindset, to really figure out where you fit and where you want to be.
To really look at the roles and responsibilities of a CISO and say, that looks interesting, that looks like a great idea, despite the risks. The rewards are worth the risk.
Yeah, the higher up you climb, the less cyber you become, the less risk averse and the more risk accepting you become. A CISO accepts far more risk than the firewall admin does. A CISO is far more business centric than they are cyber centric if they're doing their job right. It's not for everyone. You are leaving behind an awful lot of what got you there when you become a CISO.
Well, thank you, Allan. This is As always, an interesting discussion, and I love the perspective that you bring to this, having been involved in so many aspects of it and hearing from so many of the people in your community that you're involved in. You bring a great perspective to the topic.
I appreciate you. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us on the Hybrid Identity Protection Podcast with Sean Dubey. Be sure to subscribe to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you like to listen. Visit hipconf.com, that's HIPCONF.com, to learn about upcoming events, view expert presentations, and take part in the conversation.